Thanks, Philip. It didn't take quite as long as coming from China, but it did take quite a long time because I put Huddersfield into the sat-nav instead of Hull. So there we are. But yeah, anyway, let's get started. So so this is for what must be Joy and Jill. I'll use the little clicker thing. So first of all, I'd just like to say that this talk contains horses and swearing. So it does come with a trigger warning. So let's get the swearing started anyway. A good bit. This is a story about Keith Richards, guitarist and songwriter of the Rolling Stones. He's not with us today, but this story is told by American writer and comedian Dana Carvey.
He doesn't see me, and he goes over the horse, and he puts the horse's head in his hands, and he goes, "Look at you. You're a fucking horse." And he walked off.
Keith Richards wrote a song entitled Wild Horses, but he didn't seem that comfortable around them. Larkin, however, was a man of the saddle. In 1943, Larkin wrote the poem Winter. It's an early poem, written, as he said himself, before he'd hit his stride. Let me quote it for you. In the field, 2 horses. Actually, that's enough of that one. 6 years later, Larkin went to the cinema and happened to see a newsreel about Brown Jack, a famous flat racer and jumper. Inspired, he wrote the poem At Grass. A note on pronunciation, I'm saying at grass, can be at grass. I was brought up on the Staffordshire-Cheshire border, so if I'm feeling Cheshire-ish, I say at grass. But if I'm feeling Staffordshire-ish, I say at grass. So I'm Cheshire today. Anyway, I love this poem, and I think Larkin was pleased with it too. He chose it as the final poem, the showstopper, in his breakout volume, 20 Poems, in the Fantasy Poets collection, and in the Less Deceived. The subjects of At Grass are dark horses. The eye can hardly pick them out. They stand anonymous. The observer can't even tell what they are doing, the other seeming to look on. They gallop for what must be joy. Who knows? There's a word that's missing in At Grass. It was there in that poem of 1943, and it was there in the poem Larkin wrote immediately before this one, entitled To Failure. The presence, then absence, of the word is particularly apparent in Anthony Thwaites' collected edition of the poems, where the two stand chronologically side by side. Sticking with rock stars, here's a clue of that missing word. And it's not Patty. But it could be Smith, though, I guess, at a push. If the eye can hardly pick these creatures out, the mouth can hardly name them. This is the poem with a hole in the middle. Unlike Keith, Larkin knows how pointless it would be to go up to a horse and say, "Look at you, you're a fucking horse." Or take another poem, published alongside At Grass in the Less Deceived, Myxomatosis. Can you see a word that's missing? We see this absence of an animal's name in Larkin's letters too. Here's one from Letters Home, edited by James Booth. Time and again, animals slip their names in Larkin's writing. They seem to symbolize uncertainty, inscrutability, the impossibility of understanding the consciousness that is so different from our own. When Larkin does use the words for animals, we see this in his letters, it's often not to define creatures, but as terms of affection for the recipients. His friend and sometime lover Patsy Strang pulled him up on this. As Booth notes in a letter to Monica, Larkin writes, "I had a sort of difference of opinion with P. Strang about the Potter books." That's Beatrix, not Harry, obviously. She condemned them as anthropomorphist. Further, she accused me of not liking animals at all, only Potter ones and ones on my mantelpiece. Patsy, let's not forget, is the lady he called Honey Bear and Honey Guzzler. I bet that went down well. And in his biography of the poet, James Booth mentions the time when Larkin is surprised by a mouse scuttling into his room and then back into its hidey hole. Quoting Larkin, "This depresses me rather. Beatrix Potter's all very well in print, but..." And when he appeared on Desert Island Discs, Larkin told Roy Plumley that, "The only time I saw a fish caught, I was so horrified that I could never try to do it myself." Is it the act of fishing or the fish itself that horrifies him? It sounds like real animals give Larkin the willies. Stuffed or illustrated ones are things of joy, but real ones are uncanny, eerily unknowable. In Letters Home, there's a series of letters and cards that Larkin wrote to his mother Eva during her final years living in a Leicester nursing home. Larkin often sent Eva picture postcards, many featuring animals and birds, but they are hardly ever given their proper names. There's Froggy rather than Frog, Pussy rather than Cat, and even Colourful Bird rather than Toucan. Two lonely people in different parts of the country, the son too busy to visit as much as he feels he should, but trying to keep his mother's spirits up, and perhaps also his own. Right at the end of Eva's life, Larkin sends her 3 postcards of horses, 2 of them, in fact, featuring a couple of horses standing in a field. It's such a poignant read in Letters Home, as of course there are no replies. The silence echoes. A son is talking into the void. The roles reversed, a child uttering soothing words to comfort a parent, until the communication, the connection, fades away. Larkin writes, "The horses look peaceful, don't they? I wonder what they are thinking about." Horses are such an enigma. Why the long face? It's interesting that readers have pulled Larkin up on his lack of animal knowledge. In his poem The Mower, for example, he wrote that after he had mown over a hedgehog, the next morning he got up, but the hedgehog didn't. Not correct, James Booth points out. Hedgehogs are nocturnal. But hedgehogs are prickly creatures. They're as inscrutable as any other animal. How do we know what they get up to and when they get up? Especially nowadays when so many of them have been mown down. I like to think that Larkin rated At Grass so highly because of the power of that missing word, the power of not being able to speak for or even name another creature. We were chatting in the pub last night and we saw another example. Somebody showed this to me, Graham showed this to me, in the poem that Larkin wrote in a flyleaf for Monica, when he writes, "The little lives of earth and form, of finding food and keeping warm, are not like ours, and yet a kinship lingers nonetheless. We hanker for the homeliness of den and hide and set." It's like he doesn't mention them. It's like I think it's called synecdoche, isn't it? Synecdoche, whatever. When you use a feature of an animal rather than mentioning the word itself. The very inscrutability of other beings that are obviously so very different from the observer. It's been said before, but the most Larkin-esque word is perhaps. Ezra Found took perhaps to be a weak word. This is his note on the side of the wasteland. And elsewhere he says, "Damn perhapsy," to T.S. Eliot, telling T.S. Eliot off. T.S. Eliot should tell it like it is. But Larkin realised the power of perhaps. And At Grass is where it all started, perhaps. He'd played with missing letters before, like the poem Traumerei, where a silent crowd walks past the graffitied letters D, E, A, and T. Deet. The H is silent, as in fucking horse. But At Grass is where he runs with the power of a missing word. As soon as you see gaps, Think about gaps in Larkin's poetry. You notice them everywhere. Some are literal ellipses, like in Livings, where we have the blank hotel in Blankton and the Blankshire Times. The whole poem is, in fact, an ellipsis. The year is 1929, and the trader in the poem doesn't have a clue about what's just about to hit him. But the next poem in Livings, which doesn't mention where it's set, which led Clive James to wonder whether it was a lighthouse, and Craig Raine to reply, of course it's a bloody lighthouse. Or the next poem, where we never get the punchline to why is Judas like Jack Ketch. I remember coming to this conference a couple of years ago, and some idiot wouldn't let that lie. I'm glad that came up, actually. Or in the trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. Or a maiden name, 5 syllables that are referred to and whispered in a poem, but never mentioned. Unmentionables are everywhere. What loads my hands down? Maybe it's a dactyl with some extra bits. And whatever happened in the poem, whatever happened. Animals, events, and people have all slipped their names. Such absences. The observer cannot name or speak for the observed. All they can do is look on blankly. And if you take away the words, you have to describe rather than define. It's the gap where the poetry gallops in. But what does all this have to do with the theme for our conference? Well, if one of the horses in the field is Brown Jack, perhaps the other is Brown Jill. Got there eventually. Larkin started writing Jill in 1943, at the same time as that poem Winter. In the field, 2 horses. No. In the novel, the undergraduate John Kemp creates a wholly new sister, Jill, to impress his roommate Christopher. The creation is a solace to him. Jill came into his mind as now she would, though he did not know this yet, whenever his emotions were stirred gently. If things aren't going too well for John at college, at least he always has Jill. He writes about her obsessively, crafting letters from her and stories that she features in, and begins to realize what she represents to him. The sensation he had was of looking intently into the center of a pure white light. Absence of color, nothingness, that gap again. This is where John starts to create from, the gap between observer and observed. To heighten the point, John bumps into a real-life Jill, but she has slipped her name. She's Gillian, and when he calls her Jill, she shakes her head. When John finally catches sight of the real-life Gillian again after losing her, guess what's the first thing he sees as he goes running out after her? Outside in the November dark, a horse and cart were going by. As he chases Gillian, it's like he's hunting down an animal. As she alights from the bus, John saw her fawn shoulders disappearing down the stairs. So other people are just as inscrutable as horses, just as unnameable. John notes of Gillian that habit she had of appearing just at the moment when he was unable to follow her. Sorry, I really don't follow you. She's as unreadable as a horse. John creates in his mind an imaginary scene of him and Jill together as children. Jill is playing at the piano, while John stands in the garden looking in. Not only is the observer separate in space from the observed, he is separate in time too. Just as the horses in at grass seem to be having a much better time than their observer, galloping for what must be joy, the past seems so much better than the present. Jill contains many scenes of nostalgia, homesickness, the desire to return to a happier, more idyllic time. As Svetlana Boym says in The Future of Nostalgia, modern nostalgia is a mourning for the impossibility of a mythical return, for the loss of an enchanted world with clear borders and values, a home that is both physical and spiritual, the Edenic unity of time and space before entry into history. That flyleaf poem again from last night, we hanker for the homeliness of den and hole and set. When his roommate Christopher and his pals from Rampe College start to reminisce about their school days, their nostalgia sparks creative thoughts. And this is interesting that David brought this piece up as well. Little by little, John himself came to understand their sorrow as what they had lost became clearer in his mind. As the picture grew, he ornamented it with little marginal additions until in the end the thing was as unreal as a highly coloured picture of an ancient battle. Rose-tinted spectacles. Innocent childhood was so much better than today. Later in the novel, John rushes back to his hometown of Huddlesford after it's been bombed, and now that he's convinced that his parents are thoroughly dead, the very thing that in the past had most irritated him about them, these very things turned suddenly round and became emblems of their most lovable qualities. The gap between today and the misremembered past, the gap between the reality and the imaginary is huge, and that's the gap where we start to create. As soon as we do that, we're telling stories. The novel Jill is filled with writing and storytelling, short stories, letters home. They all play with the truth. When John first enters his rooms at college, he finds Christopher's appropriated all his china, but in a letter to his parents he writes, "I was able to play Lord Bountiful and unpack all my stuff, and everyone was happy and went away fed. Since then, I have been relatively popular." In a letter to his old school tutor, Mr. Crouch, he writes, "I am sorry I haven't written to you since I arrived, but I have had a great deal to do." As the narration deliciously says, that's 2 lies in 1 sentence. Even buying letter stationery leads to falsehood. The girl gave him wrong change, but he did not notice. John is eventually confronted with all these untruths when he goes back to his parents' home and looks through the window. And behind a glass vase, he could see the 6 letters he had written home, all neatly put together. That image of being on the outside, looking in, happens over and over in Larkin's work. Like in Reasons for Attendance, when the poet figure watches a dance peeking through the windows, or we have an auditory version in the later poem Broadcast, when he knows that Maeve's hands are clapping somewhere amongst the audience. In the poem The Importance of Elsewhere, Larkin writes, "Lonely in Ireland, since it was not home, strangeness made sense, but now living in England has no such excuse. It seems to be more important to long to be home than to belong at home. It's only when we're separated from our roots, from home, and from ourselves, that we can create something worthwhile." In fact, I began to entertain the very clever idea that was why Larkin and Monica often took holidays just beyond the mainland, like the Isle of Skye or on Sark, for instance, a real-life manifestation of being on the outside looking in. But then I realised that going abroad is kind of what a holiday is. But back to the writing. Artistic creation can only begin when we're beyond the room, staring through the window at the letters behind that vase. Home is so sad, but we can't help longing to be there, to return to what must be joy. John experiences this longing when he feels out of place with his fellows at Oxford. He felt as a child feels who has in a fit of temper run out of a game and, looking round, watches the game still going on despite his absence and is filled with desire to rejoin it, which is a bit like that poem Spring, isn't it? It sounds like that one, that feeling of being left out. Once you're away from the game, you want back in again, but you can never get there. And as we read in the later poem, Friday Night, the Royal Station Hotel, the headed paper made for writing home, if home existed. The horses never make it home either. In that final stanza of At Grass, and not a field glass sees them home, or curious stopwatch prophecies. Only the groom and the groom's boy with bridles in the evening come. That final rhyme is only visual. There's no resolution, no homecoming, no homecoming. Andrew Motion pointed out that the groom and groom's boy should be bringing halters if the horses are going back to the stable. But maybe that's the point. Maybe no one can ever go back, go home, neither man nor beast. Nostalgia is not what it's used to be. It takes us further and further away from what we hanker after, and into the gap falls writing. I'd argue that the movement from Jill to Jack is where Larkin harnessed the power of that gap, the inscrutability of others, and the solipsism. Indeed, in the introduction to the 1963 edition of Jill, when he has found his calling and is now a poet, he says of the book, "On looking through it again, I have made a number of minor deletions that have added nothing and rewritten nothing. The deletions are everything, the writer going through and adding the gaps." Larkin said in an interview about why he stopped writing novels, "Poems are about yourself, whereas novels are about other people. I suppose I didn't really know enough about other people, or perhaps I wasn't really interested enough in other people to be a novelist." Whether Gillian or horses, the I, the self, can hardly pick them out. This is where poetry comes from. The solipsism of being on the outside looking in, of being in the present looking back at the past, the power of remembering and misremembering. It all comes down, in fact, to memory, the flies in the ointment that lead to creativity. That's my thesis, and I'm sure the horses agree with me. Thank you.